Hey everyone, Mr. Murphy here. I'm going to be talking about Chapter 7, which is all about the cell cycle. So throughout this chapter, there's different aspects of the cell cycle that are going to be discussed. First, very broadly, just the purpose of having cell cycles at all. Then a little bit more about mitosis, then the control of the system of mitosis. We're going to return to this chapter in a little bit once we get to genetics to talk about meiosis. So if we are currently doing mitosis, you don't have to worry about 7.4 just yet. And then I will wrap up with the end of the chapter, which is about the way in which the cell can actually control the end of the cell's life, as well as the division and continuation. So this chapter, like all of them, opens with kind of a broad question that incorporates a lot of the different ideas from the unit. And this one is, how does infection with HPV result in uncontrolled cell reproduction, which is to say, how can HPV, which is a sexually transmitted disease, a virus, how can that lead to cancer, which is a concern and is the reason why HPV vaccines are recommended for people these days. So in 7.1, we introduced basically the need for cell division. The idea of the replication and reproduction of cells is a core concept of, it's a characteristic of life, and it's necessary for the continuation of an organism, right? You could have something that's alive, but if it can't reproduce, it's not going to be alive for that long in the grand scheme of things. And so in order to make it here billions of years into the path of life, we are the descendants of organisms that have been reproducing since the very beginning of cells. There's two basic ways in which reproduction can happen, and I'm sure we're vaguely familiar with these, which is asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. It's also necessary not just for creation of new organisms, but also the maintenance of cells. And so while, yes, reproduction of the organism is one big part of cell division, growth in general is a big consideration as well. Here we see the root tip of a plant. And you can actually explore these in kind of a cool way where you can see the different phases of cell division actually going on within this. So if you zoom in on different parts, you could actually see these are the cells that have finished their replication, and here along the outside you can actually capture some that are in the midst of the different phases of mitosis as the root is continuing to grow into the ground. Regeneration is another one. So here's a lizard that was unlucky enough to have his tail severed. Now, it's an adaptation of many reptiles that their tails are fairly easy to rip off, but that's which is like a defense mechanism, so that if a predator catches them, their tail is kind of a susceptible thing that's hanging out there and could be caught by a predator. And so having a quick detach system is helpful, albeit probably very painful for the animal, but there is some level of repair that can happen. And honestly, while it's kind of sad, if you go to a lot of pet stores where they might have lizards that have been in together in a tank for a long time, and maybe they're starting to get older, they're starting to get a little more defensive and antagonistic against one another, you can actually find a lot of pet store lizards that have already had that injury sustained, which is a bummer because probably people don't buy them. So go out and buy a lizard today with a messed up tail. It's the right thing to do. Asexual reproduction. This is the reproduction that occurs in basically an exact copy of the prior organism. So this is typically, this is often found in unicellular organisms simply because they are far simpler organisms. Prokaryotes especially replicate in this fashion, which produces, again, a genetically identical clone to the parent. However, it's important to note that there are still mutations. So while we say that they're genetically identical with a little asterisk next to it, that there's going to be random variation just due to the fact that replication of DNA is not a perfect process, and that's something we'll explore also in our genetics unit. Single-celled eukaryotes typically reproduce by mitosis, which again is the process that we're going to go into, prophase, metaphase, all of that. But if it's not accompanied by any sort of meiosis, if there's no sperm or egg involved, this is asexual reproduction. It gets a little bit confusing sometimes, and we just want to be clear in our minds, like when we're thinking about cells within our own bodies, our cells are reproducing through mitosis, which we could argue is asexual reproduction. That's nothing wrong with that, but make sure we understand, of course, that's different than like a whole organism that is reproducing through asexual reproduction. Because like when I make new skin cells because, I scrape my hand or something, I wouldn't say that I'm cloning myself. I might say that I'm making clones of my own skin cells. That's weird, but maybe correct. So we just want to be sure when we talk about reproduction that we are differentiating, at least in our heads, the idea of making new cells versus making new organisms. Here's an example actually of a much larger organism which asexually reproduces. So these are aspen trees that are all identical clones of one another, and there's tens of thousands of these, and basically they share a root system that grows out and then begins a new individual. And we still call it a new individual, even though these all might share a common root system. You might say, well, isn't this just one large organism? And that's certainly up for debate. If you look up, like, what's the largest organism in the world, you'll find examples of these tree systems that are absolutely massive. But ultimately, if you were to sever those root systems in a way where they're still getting their nutrients, but they're not attached anymore to the parent tree, it is functionally its own individual organism. Asexually reproduced, which is kind of cool. Sexual reproduction then is the combination of gametes. So this is sperm and egg. It's not exclusive to animals at all. Plants, the whole idea of pollen. Pollen is essentially just the capsule which contains literally the sperm cell of plants. The egg cell or the ovule is contained inside of the flowering portion of plants or inside of pine cones. So cool stuff to get into that when we talk about meiosis, again in the genetics unit, that will be something we discuss. So in this case, there are some terms that we should be familiar with because we are going to be handling different genetic components within this unit, even though we will return again in a much broader sense to genetics. So first off, DNA inside of our nucleus is in the form of chromatin, which is packaged up, wrapped up, protected inside of our nucleus. Now that during the process of cell division, mitosis or meiosis, that chromatin condenses much further into these nice little packets, which are the little X things that we're probably familiar with. So that's what a chromosome is, and that's a single molecule of DNA, and then all the proteins and stuff that are packaging it up. But that is a single continuous molecule of DNA, which could be hundreds of thousands or millions of nucleotides long. Somatic cells, so this is a term that refers to body cells. They're not specialized for reproduction, so these are the cells that are undergoing the process of mitosis, which is they replicate themselves identically. Sex cells or gametes are the cells which undergo the process of meiosis, which is fundamentally different in many ways from mitosis. There's a lot of overlap, of course, in the general mechanisms that are going on inside of the cell in terms of lining up chromosomes and spindle fibers and stuff, pulling things apart. But we do want to think of those as two different processes, and the same cell does not undergo both of those processes. So I think sometimes we learn mitosis and meiosis in close conjunction or close next to each other, right? It's like we learn mitosis, we learn meiosis, and we get it in our heads sometimes that like mitosis happens and then meiosis happens, and that is wrong. That is not how we want to think about it. They are unrelated things leading to very distinct and different end results. Within these cells, we have two sets of chromosomes. We refer to these as homologous pairs. This gets a little more confusing as we introduce new terms and things and look at it more closely in mitosis, but we want to understand the fact that, within a human, we have 46 chromosomes. And you got 23 from your mom and you got 23 from your dad. Those are homologous pairs because let's say we have chromosome number 7. I have one copy that I received from my father and I have one copy that I received from my mother. They're both programmed for the same genes, but they may be unique in the different alleles or different versions, hair color, eye color. Think about those sort of common examples. But they are still homologous pairs. They are coding for the same type of information, even though they most likely have many, many differences between them. Gametes are, again, sperm and egg. So haploid is the term that we use to refer to the chromosomal situation inside of gametes, because a gamete, a sperm or an egg cell, only has 23 chromosomes in the case of a person. So that way, one parent is passing on their one set of chromosomes, the other parent passes on their set of chromosomes, and the new organism now has two complete sets, and the term we would use for that is diploid. So fertilization is the process that happens after meiosis if two organisms are reproducing, and that results in what we call a zygote. A zygote is the new organism that is beginning to grow, that has the combination of 23, in the case of humans, 23 from mom, 23 from dad, and then now they have 46 chromosomes, and they are their own new living thing and begin to grow. Sexual life cycles involve meiosis. So like I said, that's a topic that we're going to return to probably in January. This is referred to as the Heplantic life cycle. I don't use that term, but you can. It's a fun word. This is in protists, fungi, and some algae in terms of like actual life cycle sustaining themselves in that phase. After the zygote forms, though, it undergoes. So in the case of different types of plants and fungi and things, it gets a little weird with the life cycle. So we're probably pretty familiar with general sort of animal biology and animal reproduction, where the diploid organism produces either sperm or egg cells, and those sperm and egg cells are haploid cells that don't divide on their own. It's not until you have the union of a sperm and egg cell that you would then begin to divide as the new organism. However, other life forms actually utilize a system where those haploid cells will undergo their own mitosis, and it'll actually grow as an organism that has half of the number of chromosomes that the traditional adult form of that organism will ultimately contain. So here's an example with this bread mold here, and you can see how it has its diploid life cycle, where it's a normal diploid cell, and when it undergoes meiosis, it forms these spores, and it's a single N here, meaning it's haploid, and that'll grow into a mature organism all on its own. Eventually, those mature organisms there's a male form and a female form that can come together to fertilize, and they form a zygote. And you notice how in this case with this bread mold, it's actually a relatively short period of its life that it's spending as the diploid organism. So that's kind of reverse from animals, where, of course, the majority of our lives we spend as diploid, and then the haploid portion is really preceding only reproduction. Alternation of generations is a term which applies to many plants and protists. And so what happens there is there's sort of a blending of this, where there is that haploid stage and they undergo mitosis as a haploid cells. But in the case of most plants, that's very, very brief. It is important to note that it happens because that is different from animals, but it is, like I said, not a major, or at least not a long portion of their total life cycle. So here you can see a fern plant, which is one in particular that undergoes this for longer than typical flowering plants, deciduous plants, or coniferous plants. But here it's spores, and it forms what's called a gametophyte. These are the specific terms I'm referring to and pointing out in these different cycles, not part of what you are specifically ever going to be tested on or anything, but still words that are probably worth recognizing just because they do pop up in biology a lot. Anyway, so a fern is a good example of a plant that actually does spend a fairly hefty time as a haploid, and it's interesting to look up examples of what does a haploid fern look like, because we've probably seen these things in the world. You just don't realize that it's fundamentally different than a typical plant cell that you might see, which is a two complete sets of chromosomes. The diplantic life, that's how I describe my life. This is animals and then plants, and this is where gametes, some plants, right? There's plants. The plant kingdom is huge and has many wildly different types of plants within it. Mostly referring to just all photosynthesizing things. Not all photosynthesizing things. All chloroplast containing things are plants, and there's a lot of different types of those. But the diplantic life includes animals, and this is where the gametes are really only produced for the purpose of reproduction. And if they don't succeed in reproduction, they're not continuing to live on their own. And here you can see sort of a more traditional example of sort of a life cycle where we see, yes, diploid for the vast majority as the organism matures, and then meiosis occurs, and then reproduction either happens or it doesn't. And if it does happen, then you have the new organism after fertilization. So the point of sexual reproduction ultimately is genetic diversity. We mentioned how asexual reproduction gives you functionally clones of the previous generation. Now, different organisms have ways to accomplish additional genetic diversity through other means, and we'll talk about that with bacteria. But sexual reproduction is this huge, rolling of 1,000 dice to figure out like what's the exact mix of mom and of dad, because as an organism that has 2 complete sets of chromosomes but only passes on to its offspring 1 complete set of chromosomes, it has this doubled pool of, for every chromosome it contains, it's only going to pass on 1 copy. Is it going to pass on its mom's copy of this 1 chromosome or its dad's copy of that chromosome? And for every chromosome, it's going to be a unique thing. And so sexual reproduction is this huge mix of genetics, which results in massively diverse organism, which is why no 2 individuals have exactly the same genetic makeup. And we can actually say that, like, period, no 2 individuals. Again, maybe with a little asterisk, because identical twins get weird. They started as 1 organism and then they split off and then they grow. We'll talk about that down the road. But the point is that sexual reproduction is a huge diversity mechanism. That's the whole point in why it has developed as a thing in life, because as we will continue to learn, diversity is sort of the key to success. By being very diverse, a population is ensuring that, well, not ensuring, but further giving hope that when faced with challenges, some organisms will be equipped to survive and to continue that cycle of life. And of course, look around us today, so many sexually reproducing organisms that are still here today. So clearly it works. Now, you could also make the argument that the fact that we can find bacteria on like every surface around us also kind of speaks pretty well to the success of asexual reproduction as well. So, at the end of the day, if a living thing is here today, it's been pretty successful for billions of years. That is the end of this little brief intro. Like I said, don't forget, meiosis is not going to be part of this unit. We are going to push meiosis to be something that we return to later, kind of intentionally. 1, because it fits in so well with genetics, but also because I kind of like to give some distance between mitosis and meiosis, because we don't really want to conflate the 2 as being overly related just because they happen to have like prophase and metaphase and stuff in common. That's it. Let me know if you have questions.